is Nicole. I'm a tea writer and educator, and I'm here to help you learn more about tea. Today, I'll be sharing 6 tips on how to make the best matcha. Keep in mind that these are only tips. As long as you enjoy the taste of your tea, that's all that really matters, but these are just some things that I've learned in my experience. The first and I think most important tip that I have is the quality of your tea. Matcha comes in a lot of different ranges, from very high quality to very low quality. And it can be hard to know what you're getting, but some things to look for is you want to make sure that the tea is from Japan. You can certainly find matcha from other places, but to be honest, I don't really consider those matcha. Is the taste of tea changes if you grow it in a different place. So if the tea is made in China instead and is prepared in all the same ways, it's not going to taste exactly the same as matcha from Japan. So that's something that I'm a real stickler for. You want to make sure that you're looking for a bright green color. If it's kind of like a faded green or if it's brown, that's definitely matcha you want to avoid. I would also say to look for matcha that is ceremonial grade, with the one caveat that there really is no actual definition for ceremonial grade, so there's no regulation as to what the quality of the tea is. You want to make sure that you're not using culinary grade, as that's typically lower grade because it's used for cooking purposes, and it's not going to taste very good if you're drinking it straight. My next tip is water temperature. A lot of times on Reddit or other forums, I'll see people complaining about their matcha being bitter. And just like any other green tea, you want to make sure that you're using much cooler water that's not fully boiling when you're making matcha. For me, the sweet spot is generally about 160 to 175 degrees. The company that you get your matcha from most likely has a recommendation for how they think the matcha should be made, but if you're finding that the taste is still too bitter for you, you can definitely adjust to a lower temperature. Tip number 3 is to make sure that you're not using too much water. A lot of times we think of as a cup of tea as like a big mug, but that's just too much water for mixing with your matcha. Depending on how you want to do it, you're going to use about 4 to 6 ounces of water. So that would actually be even less than half a cup. And that's what you're going to do to whisk your matcha. From there, if you want to make it into a latte, pour it into more water, pour it into something like juice or sparkling water, you can certainly do that. But you want to make sure that you're not diluting your matcha too much. You're not really going to taste it if you're making it with too much water. One thing that people tend to struggle with when they first start making matcha is the clumps. They just kind of naturally happen. Static electricity makes the leaf particles of the powder kind of stick to each other. And the solution for that is to sift your matcha. So kind of like if you're baking a cake and they'll tell you to sift the flour, it's the same principle that you would use for making your matcha. So for a lot of times for that, I'll just use like an old tea strainer. You do want to make sure that you dedicate your tea strainer to sifting matcha, so that way you're not mixing flavors, and also make sure that you wash and dry it thoroughly in between uses. Tip number 5 is to make sure that you whisk, not stir. Making matcha can sometimes be an uncomfortable or unusual feeling because we're used to the idea of like you would with like chocolate milk powder or something where you stir it to mix. With matcha, it does not actually dissolve in the water, so stirring does not help in your making of the matcha. It might actually make it worse because you're not going to evenly disperse the green tea powder in the water. So I do recommend absolutely using a chasen. This is a traditional way of whisking matcha, and while it may seem unnecessary, I find that it actually really changes how the matcha is mixed in. It's certainly been used for a long time for a reason. You can find these in tea shops for a very inexpensive price, so I would definitely recommend picking up one of these if you plan to make matcha on a regular basis. And part of that also is you want to make sure that your bowl is kind of wide and a bit flat. If you don't have a real matcha bowl, then that's perfectly fine. I used soup bowls and cereal bowls for a really long time. You just want to make sure that you have a wider space so that you can whisk your matcha properly. So when you're whisking, you want to make sure that you're going in an M motion. You want to be making this motion primarily with your wrist. That can be a bit tricky at first, especially if you're new to making matcha, but you want to make sure that you're not kind of using your whole arm. If your arm is getting tired or hurting from whisking, it means that you're not doing it quite right. You really don't need to put a lot of effort into whisking. One thing I also see a lot of people do is they kind of grind into it. Especially when I worked at Tivana, a lot of my staff would do that and I'd have to train them out of doing it. You just want to make sure that you're not grinding it. You want to be just gently whisking, barely grazing the bottom of the bowl. Grinding won't disperse your matcha evenly and it could potentially bring out more bitterness. You'll also wind up with lots of little clumps at the bottom of the bowl. And last but not least, my sixth tip is practice makes perfect. No one is born knowing how to make matcha. I know we go on Instagram and you see these like picture perfect bowls that people post. That just takes a lot of practice. It certainly took me a long time and it's going to take you a while if you're just starting out with matcha. So don't be too hard on yourself if it doesn't look picture perfect from the beginning. It's just really just like anything else that you're doing, whether it's playing an instrument or, you know, some kind of art. Practicing really does make you better at doing things. So as frustrating as that can be, just try your best every time that you make matcha and you will see an improvement over time. Ultimately, the goal is to have lots of tiny bubbles instead of big bubbles, and you will get there. It's just going to take some time. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about matcha or if there's videos about it that you would like to see in the future. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next week.